Hi everyone and welcome to episode 117 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. I've spoken a lot over the years about the importance of land value and how it's a really important component of any investment property. Obviously with housing it's a pretty standard inclusion, but we've spoken as well about from an apartment perspective how having the right apartment, it makes up a large proportion of the value. But what we've also spoken about at different stages is how it gets to the point where land starts to exceed the value of the improvements. And certainly with houses, we've seen that plenty of times where they perhaps haven't been renovated and have started to really depreciate in value. And so in in metropolitan Melbourne, a lot of the middle ring suburbs where perhaps there's not the same heritage or development controls, that there's been a lot of development go on old housing sites. But what we've started to see in more recent times is that the older style apartment buildings have gotten to the point where the underlying land value has started to exceed the value of those apartment buildings and even of the sum of the parts of those apartments. And what that's led to has been developers and builders starting to look to purchase those properties. And we've started to see that more and more in recent times. So what I wanted to talk today about was how perhaps you can go about that and sell an entire block to a developer. And the process that needs to be followed. And it's a very, very different approach to just your standard selling of a single house. There's a lot more involved with that. So that's what we wanted to focus on today. And it's not so much about the standard aspects, which I've spoken before about when selling a house, around agent and method of sale and timing and presentation, although they are all still very important and need to make up a key component. But it's not what I wanted to focus on today. I want to focus more on the key attributes and some of the specific considerations that you need to take into account before you even embark on this process, if it's going to be possible. So let's have a look at some of the key characteristics, and I'll go through those with you today. The first one is determining the highest and best value of the property, and it's probably the most important when it comes to looking at this, because it's really going to determine whether or not it's worth pursuing this process at all. So what you need to look at is determine whether or not the total value of the property is going to be greater than the sum of the apartments within the building. And not only just by a little margin, it can't be just by a small amount. It needs to be by a considerable amount that it's justified to do that, because there's going to be a fair amount of hassle and difficulty in going through this process. So it's going to need to be justified for everyone. And so there's typically three ways to look at the highest and best value. One of them is going to be that it's the land value is the greatest, and the sum and the improvements have depreciated to a point where they're not adding value, and the land has exceeded that. It's the other is to sell to a passive investor who perhaps would be a single owner and would just continue to maintain the property from a land value point of view. And then the final is that it really hasn't gotten to a point where it's justifiable and it really just is still worth the value of the individual apartments on their own. So let's look at the land value, and that's really, as I said, gotten to the point where the land has exceeded the value of any of the improvements. And it's typically, this is what you want and this is what you need if you're going to be able to proceed with this process. And the incentive is then going to be there for all parties, whether that is financially from an investor's perspective, but also from an owner-occupier's point of view. And even from a long-term owner-occupier's perspective, and that's usually where you'll probably get the greatest resistance from an owner. But if you can show that there's benefit in them, perhaps, or it's going to put them in a position where they can actually improve their standard of living, improve where they have been living, then that's where you'll get engagement on that side of it. From a passive investor, if that's where the value ends up coming in, this is more where the buyer is going to be looking at the property to continue to help to build value. Obviously the rental income is going to be important, but the reason that that's probably not going to justify you proceeding as a group is that the passive investor who's looking to buy this is probably going to be looking to pay less than what the total sum of the parts is. So they almost want a bulk discount. So if each apartment's worth $100,000 and you've got 10 apartments in the complex, total value $1 million, they're probably going to be wanting to purchase it for less than $1 million in order to justify, and then hope, or that with the intention of buying the property that's then going to get to the point where they can sell it to a developer because the land is exceeded. So the passive investor is not really what you want. And if it gets to the point where the third option, which is the sum of the apartments, is the greatest, well, then that means that you're probably still better off selling on your own than you are as to do it as a group, because you'll get greater benefit that way. So it's really to look at those three options. If you're at the point where the land value is the greatest of those three, then that's where you can start to pursue selling it as a group. The second consideration that needs to be looked at is determining the other owners within the block, what their motivations are. And when you've got a multi-unit block of any type, there's going to be different stages of ownership, and there's going to be different motivations of ownership within that complex. So the different types of owners, you're typically going to have investors who are going to be fairly financially motivated. It's the reason that they've purchased property. So if you can show the financial justification and reasons, then there's going to be good engagement, I would expect, from someone like that. But from an owner-occupier's perspective, as I said before, that can be where you might get a little bit of resistance. Finances, particularly if they've been in the building for an extended period of time, are not necessarily going to be the main motivation. It's typically going to be more the ease of life and where they've been, but also potentially the community that they've developed over a period of time. But if you can show them that there is financial benefit and potentially lifestyle benefit by considering this, then that's where you're more likely to get engagement on this type of thing. The other consideration is the length of ownership in terms of a motivation. And those that have owned a property for a more extended period of time are probably going to have a more open mind nature to this, because they'll have hopefully built up some equity over a period of time, and are potentially looking at a next stage of property ownership, whether that's using the equity for something else or retirement, that type of thing. Those that have had only owned a property for a short period of time, it's going to be tougher, because they'll have the transaction costs in mind of what they've just recently purchased, which is obviously going to be expensive. We've spoken previously about how expensive buying and selling property is. So they'll be thinking of, well, I've just paid stamp duty, and if I sell, then I'm going to go and pay stamp duty again, plus the buying and selling costs associated with purchasing a property. So the profit margins for someone that's purchased recently are going to be far tighter. So you're going to need to give them a lot more of an incentive and have a greater benefit in terms from a financial perspective than perhaps someone that's owned a property for a longer period of time. Then the next consideration that I think is really important is around agreement. And with this type of process, you have to get 100% agreement from all owners. So if you've got someone in there that's holding out or is absolutely adamant that they're not going to proceed with this, then it's going to make the process very difficult. And so how far you want to proceed with your investigations can quite often be dictated by one party. So it's not like, say, some other decisions within your owner's corporation where you may need just a majority, or you may need a high proportion of people to agree to something, and then you can push it through. With this, it needs to be unanimous. Now, if you look at, say, somewhere like New South Wales, there are slightly different considerations there, where I think it was back in 2016 they introduced that if you've got a majority of 75% or more owners that are pushing to do something, then there can be enforcement to have others sell. However, that hasn't really led to a hell of a lot of actual transactions occurring, but it does at least give the opportunity in that regard. We don't have that in Victoria, so it's not something that you can consider. So that the New South Wales option it's a form of almost private compulsory acquisition, but as I said, it hasn't been overly successful, and there's been a fair bit of pushback on it. The next consideration is how the value of the property is to be apportioned between individual owners. And it can be a really interesting discussion that people have to have. And the most traditional way is through the unit entitlement, which is stated within the certificate of title. And this typically apportions a unit value or a unit entitlement per entity within the owner's corporate or within the certificate of title. So it might be that an apartment gets some form of entitlement, a car space might get some form of entitlement, and a storage cage might get some form of entitlement. And it really depends on how the certificate of title is set up as to whether or not it's just one per apartment, or whether or not the individual entities there might get individuals. But basically how it works is that whatever the unit amount is as a percentage of the overall development is your percentage of ownership. So again, using that example before, if you've got 10 apartments within the complex and there's 10 unit entitlements per apartment, then you've got 10% ownership of that block. And so if the whole development was to be sold, then you would get 10% of the sale price. Now, the disagreements in this approach come about sometimes when people feel as though that unit entitlement doesn't reflect their property appropriately. And it might be in the sense that they feel like they're in a better position within the block, or they've recently renovated their property fully versus someone that perhaps is their apartment's in original condition. There might be differences in size, or there might be courtyards that have got some form of license agreement in place with the owners corporation, which they feel adds value. I guess the key thing to consider here is who the buyer is. And if the buyer is a developer, then really their motivation is not a renovated or an unrenovated apartment. Their motivation is to get the site to most likely demolish and then build something else. So if that's the case, then the unit entitlement approach is generally the fairest and most equitable way to do things, because it values the properties as the buyer is looking to do themselves. The next consideration is around determining a minimum sale price. Now, everyone is going to have a dream price, and it will most likely differ because you've got different motivations, as we've said before. But because you've got different owners with those different motivations, there's going to be different levels of commitment, and that's what you need to really try and anchor everyone down. By determining a minimum price that everyone will accept, it means that you can try and start to hold people accountable. And you really do, in this instance, need to have a formal agreement in place with all owners stipulating what that minimum amount is. Because once you get closer, or you come to auction day, or the conclusion of an expression of interest, or even just private sale negotiations, what you don't want is one person who everyone's agreed on something starts moving the goalposts. So you might have all agreed that $1 million was the minimum price, but come the day, someone's gotten excited, or a family member's gotten in someone's ear, and all of a sudden it's, well, I think we should be getting 1.1 and I'm not signing a contract unless we do. And so people can have committed to this process, spent lots of money on getting through it, getting legal documents and things drawn up, only to have one person blow it all up in one hit. So having that agreement means that if you hit that price or exceed it and everyone else is happy, then it can be sold. So I think it's a really important thing to have done, so that everyone's on the same page and everyone knows, and it holds everyone accountable when you come to the nitty-gritty of the end negotiations. And then finally, it's around having independent advice. Now, regular listeners of the podcast will know that I'm very much wanting to make sure this podcast is not self-serving and is not about business development. It's about education. But I really do feel with something like this that you need to have someone who's independent with no vested interest in the process, advising the whole group, as opposed to having, say, one individual really driving it. So if you've got a member of the owners corporation who's really pushing things forward, well, then there may well be some self-interest there. Or if it's the real estate agent, then they may well be pushing just to get the sale through. Having someone independent involved who can advise on all of these steps that we've spoken about, but also provide strategic advice for the group as a whole rather than for any individual, means that it puts a lot more confidence in everyone that their needs are being met and what they say is being heard as well, as opposed to having one person who's in there really driving it home. So I think that independent advice, separate from all interested parties, means that the real estate agent can also focus on what they've got to do in terms of dealing with the buyer and getting everything done. And that independent advisor can sort of really focus on the needs of all of the separate vendors and help them to understand the process and what's going on. So I think that's a really important process and an important thing to consider if you were going down this path. Now, we have conducted a number of these over the years, and I think what we've found is it's really important up front to get everything organised and have a strategic plan laid out for everyone to see and consider, so that by the time you get to the point of appointing real estate agents and determining methods of sale and going through those usual sale processes, everyone's on the same page, everyone's like-minded, and it can be a fairly smooth transition and you can achieve some really, really good results. But it's important to set it up in the first place. And if you do that, then it gives you every chance to get a successful result. So that's it for episode 117 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. Thanks again for joining me. As always, please feel free to share the podcast far and wide, and subscribe to all of our social media channels. Otherwise, if you'd like further information, visit our website, wakeland.com.au. Otherwise, we wish you all the best with your property decisions.